Welcome to Intention to Treat from the New England Journal of Medicine. I'm Rachel Gottbaum. Today, we're looking at how beliefs about race make their way into medicine and are accepted as science. Specifically, how an instrument called the spirometer, which measures lung capacity, has been used to codify perceived biological differences between white and black patients.
I'm Lundy Brown. I have been for about 40 years a professor of pathology and laboratory medicine and Africana studies at Brown University. I'm now an emeritus professor. A good part of my time at Brown was actually writing a book entitled Breathing Race into the Machine: The Surprising Career of the Spirometer from Plantation to Genetics. The spirometer, it's an instrument where you essentially breathe in as hard as you can, and then you breathe out. And the spirometer measures that difference between what you breathe in and breathe out, and it's called lung capacity. I was sitting down at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, and I saw this article in the paper, very short one, about the lungs of Black people being smaller than the lungs of white people. And I was taken aback by this notion, and I wondered where it came from. It was a short article related to a huge asbestos lawsuit. And in that lawsuit, Black workers were being excluded from compensation because of their lungs. In order to be compensated, you had to achieve this certain norm of lung function, and the norm was the white norm. So you had to show a sufficient decline in order to be compensated. The assumption that had been built up over the years through hundreds of scientific papers was that the lungs differed, and that difference stemmed from inferior, smaller lungs. I was truly shocked when I read the article, just shocked. And that it was being applied in compensation cases. People were being denied fair compensation because they were Black. But then I thought, I'm just going to look at this as dispassionately as possible because it can't be true. So I approached a good friend of mine who was an occupational physician and asked him about it. And he said, yes, it's contemporary practice, it's widespread, and there's tons of evidence. And he pulled out a lot of papers for me. He said the consensus in medicine was that the lungs of Black people differed from the lungs of white people, that they were smaller. That's how people were trained. And then I started interviewing physicians, and they indeed said they were trained to think that the lungs of Black people and white people differed. The consensus was that difference was inferior. As I was doing my research, I came across the fact that Thomas Jefferson spoke about pulmonary dysfunction in enslaved people. It's actually in a short paragraph in the notes on the state of Virginia where he discusses pulmonary dysfunction. That would have been consigned to the dustbins of history if, in fact, Samuel Cartwright hadn't given it an empirical foundation. Samuel Cartwright was a plantation physician who was a scientist himself, and he built his own spirometer around 1850s. He found that the lungs of Black people differed significantly, and he gave a percentage to that difference. The lung capacity of Black people was 20% lower than it was in white people. So these ideas were circulating throughout the 19th century. probably the most important person because he was cited frequently, including in the 21st century, was Benjamin Gould. Benjamin Gould was hired by the U.S. Sanitary Commission to study anthropometry, which is measuring various parts of the body. He was fascinated with lung capacity, and he did a massive study and found difference in Black people as compared to white people. These ideas were never refuted, and they just got picked up and carried on into what we would consider more serious scientific studies, and have until very recently. There's a 2010 New England Journal of Medicine paper where the author cites Benjamin Gould, and the author did raise questions about, just because somebody's racist, do you not cite them? The idea of difference persisted, and it was commonly seen in the scientific literature. And it was late 60s. There is this study from Fort Devens where they concluded that the difference that they observed in lung function was due to genes. And they both invoked genes and dismissed social conditions. In 1974, race correction became a major part of pulmonary medicine. So a study in 1974 in Louisiana in an asbestos factory looked at Black people in that asbestos factory and compared them to white people in that factory, and then took the difference as irrefutable. It never occurred to them to ask the question differently. Many people in medicine were trained in the regime of racial science, and it seemed normative. And I think they thought that they were simply presenting the science in a more accurate way. Nobody was interested in my work when I was doing it, and there was deep hostility to it when I was doing this work and presenting it. Why am I, coming from outside pulmonology, how could I question all these scientists? I went through 226 papers, and it really shocked me that there was almost zero questioning about the practice of thinking that Black people's lungs differed. What changed is really social movements, and that changed after George Floyd's murder. So medical schools across the country were really picking this up. There were demonstrations everywhere. Our medical school had demonstrations around George Floyd's murder. And I think racism became much more on the agenda. There were a group of young attendings and medical students who were raising questions and petitioning about race correction. So there was a lot going on in the country, and it became uncomfortable in some ways for pulmonology to not be addressing race correction that was so deeply entrenched. So I was invited to join the American Thoracic Society working group in 2021. It was unusual to have a historian in the group. And there were a series of recommendations. And one of the recommendations was to use a race-neutral approach. You don't get answers to questions you don't ask. And maybe that's one of the contributions of the book, is it's not about race getting into the fabric of medicine, but of racism getting into the fabric of medicine.
Lundy Brown helped make the case that a major overhaul was needed in how lung function was scored and evaluated. And last year, a new measurement, designed to be race neutral, became the global standard for lung function testing. The implications of this change are huge, ranging from where patients may be placed on a transplant waiting list to whether or not they receive federal disability benefits. To help us understand more about this, we're joined by Dr. Aaron Baugh. He's a pulmonologist at the University of California at San Francisco who studies racial disparities in healthcare, and also Dr. James Diao, a resident physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston and lead author of a study recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine that looked at thousands of patients' status before and after the lung equation was changed. Dr. Diao, I'd like to start with you. Tell us what you found when you compared patient outcomes before and after the race adjustment for lung function testing was removed.
What we found was that essentially when you adjust for race, what you're doing, it makes Asian and Black individuals look less sick, and it makes Hispanic and white individuals look more sick. And so when you get rid of this race-based adjustment, then you end up seeing the exact opposite effect where Asian and Hispanic individuals will appear more sick and white individuals will appear less sick. And what this means is when Black individuals appear more sick, more of them will qualify for certain follow-up testing to investigate for lung disease or certain lung disease classifications. If they have COPD or some types of lung disease, they might be classified as a more severe grade of lung disease. They might be less likely to qualify for certain occupations. They might also get higher payments from organizations like Veterans Affairs. And then if they were being evaluated for lung transplant, they might also have been assigned greater priority for lung transplant if they had been evaluated with a race neutral equation. And so these are all pretty substantial effects that we sought to quantify.
So a key way lung function has been evaluated, and this is what we're talking about, is with the spirometer. It's a tool that's been around for several hundred years. A person blows into it to see how much breath capacity there is. What kinds of specific changes did you find when the traditional spirometry score was no longer based on race?
One of them is tens of millions of people that if you were to evaluate them with spirometry would have some kind of different clinical classification, meaning that before they would be classified as having low lung function or impaired lung function, and now they don't. Or there's also millions of individuals who would be classified with more or less severe lung disease. There would be millions of individuals who, if they were interested in pursuing work as a firefighter, would newly qualify or no longer qualify. I think one of the more specific findings we had is with respect to Veterans Affairs disability compensation. The disability compensation for Black veterans would increase by about 17%, summing to more than $1 billion across all of these veterans. And then for white veterans would decrease by about 1%, summing to about $500 million. And so pretty substantial reallocation of Veterans Affairs funding that I think has a lot of implications for how, for example, policymakers at the VA will think about allocating money and how money might have been misallocated in the past.
So these race-based measures of lung function using spirometry were also used to determine who would be placed on a transplant waiting list and where they might be placed on that list. Can you explain more about that?
So there is this system called the lung allocation score to assess basically how much you would benefit from having a lung and how badly you need it. And what we found is that if you had used a race neutral equation instead of the race-based equation, then people would move around substantially on the lung transplant waiting list. And so about 90% of them would end up in a different spot. And essentially what we found is that Asian and Black individuals would move up on the waiting list, so higher priority, and then Hispanic and white individuals would move downwards, so lower priority.
So this really impacts a lot of patients' lives. Dr. Baugh, I want to turn to you now. You trained as a pulmonologist. How did you use spirometry, and how were you taught to view race when evaluating lung function?
When I went to medical school, this is one of the topics that received pretty short shrift, but what they said to us is that, we've observed that there's these differences in average lung function across different racial ethnic groups or across different populations. And really, the key is that this is just about body proportion, because people that live near the equator, they have longer limbs and the smaller trunk. And so it's easier for heat to escape. And then if you live more up north, it's not the same ratio. The key point they kind of made is these were not clinically important differences. They don't tell us anything about the person's health, and in fact would confuse us about the nature of the person's health if we didn't do something to statistically correct for or address them. And so that's why in our modern practice, it was very important that we made these distinctions between whether the patient in front of us was Black or white or Asian or what have you, before we went about trying to interpret the results of their spirometry.
So when did you start questioning this practice?
Over time, I started to notice a couple things. Over and over again, I would see that both in my studies and also just in my clinical care, my minority patients, my Black patients were so much sicker and doing so much worse at the bedside with me. But when I checked their lung function, it was often being reported as higher than, white individuals who I knew were doing better. And so this was always a puzzle of not just me, but like, hey, everyone's been thinking about this. And people went through a lot of things of why could this thing be right? Or why could this be this way? And part of it was about, is there structural inequities? Are they receiving different care? And yes, and those things are all certainly true and part of the conversation. But kind of the question no one had asked was, could this be wrong in this weird discordance we're having? Could it just be because maybe we're interpreting this wrong, whether we're using adjustments, whether we're using correction factors, whatever approach you use statistically to get rid of the effect of those racial differences? What if that's actually causing confusion and blocking our clarity instead of enhancing it?
This all sounds very confusing for a doctor, especially since these adjustments for race were designed to correct for what were seen as biological differences.
It was always, what were we seeing? We see in the data Black patients reporting worse quality of life and healthcare related quality of life, more symptoms, more likely to require intubation and being put on a breathing machine when they come into the hospital for exacerbations or flare-ups of their lung disease. So these are the kind of things that we can see, even though they have the same lung function. And that right there probably should have given us pause, right? Because if you think everyone's lung is basically the same across all human beings, then you would expect that for a given level of lung function, there's a given level of symptoms or capacity, right? But that wasn't showing up. I always felt like there was something that we were missing. And that was part of my motivation to become a health disparities researcher. It should be possible to treat everyone well and to get high outcomes and good outcomes in all people. And I think the real challenge of these clinical algorithms is that you often don't think about how the data is processed, right? You think about the outcome, the final answer you have, that okay, this lung function is 86% of expected or 50% or 30%. You don't say oh, well, what if they're using the wrong interpretive equations? And so in all my searching for what was I missing, really one of the last things I came to was this idea that maybe the thing I was missing is that we were misrepresenting people's underlying lung function through our interpretive strategy or our reference equation. And I didn't come to this out of some, brilliance of my own, but really being pushed to answer this question by public pressure, by other scholars that were pointing out, from outside pulmonology, that were kind of criticizing us of why are you using this, which then forced me to ask for myself, why am I using this?
But you also got pushback. I mean, these changes didn't happen until last year, and many pulmonologists wanted to keep them. They said there clearly is a difference.
A lot of hesitance came from a couple different directions. One big one is, if we make a change, what's going to happen? And do we know enough about What are the consequences for different groups if we make these changes? And is it going to be something that expands equity and fairness and high quality treatment for someone? Or is it going to inadvertently do something that makes the situation worse for patients? And we don't want to be into that situation. In my role as a physician, it is not my job to be the final decision maker. I'm an expert advisor. I can't tell the VA what the level of payments should be for veterans that are injured or disabled. I can't tell a firefighter what lung function you should have to go out and rescue people from burning buildings. But it's my duty to give them the highest quality of scientific data on, like, let me help you understand my best understanding of the lung. And then you can make the decision that lines up. And the current best understanding of the lung, it looks like now, based on this weight of evidence, is that race is not really adding what we thought it was in terms of clarity to the picture. So I can't justify using it anymore. Other parts of medicine talk about consequences, right? So at some blood pressure, you have a stroke or have a heart attack. At some level of obesity, you're going to come into the hospital. You're going to be more sick and have a less good life. Can we get to those kind of questions with pulmonary medicine? Is there a level of lung function at which you die, at which you come into the hospital more commonly? Those things would be relevant ways to anchor our outcomes that are not about comparing us to each other and coming to a definition or an argument about who is normal and what does normal really mean.
Obviously, race neutrality is a challenge to achieve when it comes to lung function testing. But are these new equations getting us there?
Yeah, so I think there's race neutral in many different aspects. One would be whether the clinician sitting in front of you has to push a button or type in something to indicate what race you identify as or what race they think you are. So I think from that aspect, the new equations are race neutral. I think there are other aspects of race neutrality. So for example, whether race was used to develop the equations or has a role in what the final equation looks like. From that aspect, we have not met this goal. Another aspect is, do we really understand why these differences exist in the first place? And I think from that aspect, we also haven't met that goal. And I think there's more that can be done to push equations towards this goal and where we understand where these differences are coming from and can account for them in a way that doesn't just mask these disparities, but uses them to further our understanding of lung health and disease.
Dr. Ball, what are your thoughts?
So these equations are not truly race neutral. What they are is race averaged. And yes, things need to be more representative. We need to get more data from more different people and populations around the globe. We need to capture more so we can see the true diversity that we have on Earth. But also, I think one key thing that happened is everyone is now measured on the same scale. And what I would say is that even if your scale is imperfect, the fact that we're all measured by one yardstick, now I can start to understand and I can see the differences and start to investigate why those differences exist.
So these new algorithms need to be implemented across healthcare systems and with providers. How challenging is that?
This is an immense challenge in terms of just even the most practical details. The majority of spirometers in this country, the large, high-quality spirometers that we use in our labs that are like big machines, they can handle the new equations. My medical center, University of California, San Francisco, we had to buy a whole new software package and update and even change providers in order to do that. But there's many handheld spirometers that are used in family medicine clinics at, smaller practices all over where you're not in a big central pulmonary testing facility. And those smaller handheld devices, the simpler ones, they can't even handle the complexity of these new equations. And so you have a real problem of like, do you replace all this equipment, which is, millions or billions of dollars you could imagine across the whole country, or do you somehow take the raw data and send it to some clearinghouse and have it reformatted against the new equations there? So this is an immense investment and very complex.
So we haven't solved the problem, but it sounds like in your view we're getting closer to reducing some inequities in care. What do you see as needed moving forward?
What we ultimately want is to understand the determinants of lung health, what makes people have healthier lungs and what makes people have lower lung function. And especially, are there parts of these that are actionable? Are there modifiable things about the way we live as individuals and as societies that could help as many people have the best lung function as possible? And because in the past we settled this and we said, oh, we figured it out. It is race. It's not any of these other things. We walked away from a lot of these questions. And so through the study of disparities and what's happening with these minority populations, we can get insights knowing that we all have agreed that everyone's lung is the same across all humans. So let's use this study to understand what's really influencing our lungs for good and for bad, and how can we use that knowledge to make everyone's life better.
Thank you both so very much.
Thanks so much, Rachel. It's been a pleasure discussing these with you and with Dr. Baugh.
Thank you so much to you, Rachel, and to you, Dr. Dial. It's been a great discussion, and thank you for having me.
We had help from our managing editor, Deborah Molina, and deputy editor, Dr. Darren Teichman. Our engineer is Adam Strauss. Next time, part 2 in our series. What happens when race is used to measure perceived biological differences in patients?
Like if they're Black, then they're flagged as normal. And if they're not Black, then they're flagged as abnormal. So obviously in the abnormal case, you would send more tests. You would work them up for why that's abnormal. You'd think really hard about them. But for some reason, if the patient was flagged as Black, that's sort of like normal and you're done.
That's next time on Intention to Treat from the New England Journal of Medicine. I'm Rachel Gottbaum.